In the winter of 1955, the entire Angelus choir vanished without a trace in the stark mountains of rural Pennsylvania. 50 years later, a sealed chapel found behind a bricked-up wall would reveal a truth far more sinister than a simple accident. The story that had been accepted as a tragic act of God was, in fact, an act of man, and the silence that followed was not one of reverence, but of conspiracy. A half-century of grief was built upon a calculated lie. St. Jude's Home for Children was an institution defined by isolation. Perched high in the Allegheny Mountains, it was a place of last resort, a stone fortress against a harsh world. Housing orphans society had largely forgotten. The winters there were notoriously brutal, cutting the home off for weeks at a time. This geographic solitude bred a unique culture of self-reliance and insularity, a world unto itself where the outside seemed a distant, almost imaginary place. The home was run by the charismatic and widely respected Father Michael. To the surrounding communities and the diocese, he was a paragon of virtue, a man who had dedicated his life to the care of lost children. His sermons were moving, his fundraising effective, and his control over St. Jude's absolute. He presented a face of benevolent authority, a shepherd guiding his flock through difficult times, and no one ever thought to question his methods or his motivations. St. Jude's sole claim to fame was the Angelus Choir. Comprised of 22 of its most gifted residents, the choir's ethereal voices were a regional sensation. They were the pride of the orphanage, proof that beauty could blossom in even the most desolate of places. Their Christmas performances were legendary, drawing crowds from across the state and, more importantly, opening the wallets of wealthy patrons who were essential for the institution's survival. It was a beacon of hope in a place that had little. The choir was led by Samuel Finch, a 14-year-old with a prodigious talent and a solemn maturity beyond his years. He was not just the lead singer, he was the de facto older brother to the entire group, especially the younger members who looked to him for guidance and protection. Samuel possessed a keen sense of observation and a quiet intensity, his protective nature a silent promise to the other children that he would always watch over them within the cold walls of St. Jude's. On the night of December 20th, 1955, a record-breaking blizzard descended upon the region. The snow began as a gentle flurry but quickly intensified into a blinding, howling gale. The wind howled through the mountain passes, and the radio issued stern warnings for all residents to stay indoors. It was the kind of storm that erased roads, toppled trees, and buried the landscape in a deep, unforgiving blanket of white, transforming the familiar world into something alien and treacherous. Despite the rapidly deteriorating conditions, Father Michael was adamant that the choir's scheduled Christmas concert in the state capitol must proceed. He framed it as an unbreakable commitment, a vital fundraising opportunity that St. Jude's could not afford to miss. To cancel, he argued, would be to let down their most important benefactors and endanger the future of the home itself. His insistence seemed born of duty, but a frantic energy underscored his words, silencing any dissent from the small staff. The children were gathered in the main hall, their faces a mixture of excitement for the performance and apprehension about the storm raging outside. They were bundled into their matching performance coats, dark wool against the swirling white snow visible through the tall, arched windows. Their songbooks, bound in worn leather, were clutched in their gloved hands. They were a picture of youthful innocence, poised on the precipice of a journey from which they would never return, their final hours ticking away. The last time anyone saw them alive was in the dim glow of the orphanage's porch lights. One by one, the 22 children filed out of the heavy oak doors and boarded an old yellow school bus, its engine rumbling against the storm's fury. Samuel Finch was the last to board, turning to give a final reassuring nod to a worried staff member before he disappeared inside. The doors hissed shut, sealing them away from the only home they knew. The bus pulled away from St. Jude's, its headlights cutting two feeble beams into the maelstrom. It navigated the winding driveway and turned onto the mountain road, quickly becoming a faint speck of light before being swallowed completely by the blizzard. For the few staff members who remained, watching from the windows, it was a familiar sight. They had watched that bus leave for countless performances before. All was to return with tired but triumphant children. This time, there would be no return. Hours later, the concert hall in the state capitol remained empty. The choir never arrived. The initial calls to the orphanage went unanswered, the phone lines already downed by the storm. A quiet, gnawing anxiety began to spread among the concert organizers. As the night wore on and the blizzard intensified, that anxiety curdled into a dreadful certainty. Something had gone terribly, horribly wrong on that isolated mountain pass, and the music of the Angelus choir had fallen silent. A search party was dispatched the following morning, but their efforts were severely hampered by the impassable snowdrifts that choked every road. It took 2 full days for the storm to subside enough for a proper search to be conducted. The team, composed of state troopers and local volunteers, battled the elements, their hopes dwindling with each passing hour. The pristine, unbroken white of the landscape offered no clues, no signs of life, only a profound and chilling silence. Finally, a breakthrough came. A state trooper spotted them, a set of tire tracks veering sharply off the treacherous Route 9 pass. The tracks led directly toward the edge of a steep, rocky cliff overlooking the raging Black River. They stopped abruptly at the precipice. The implication was immediate and horrifying. There was no sign of a struggle, no debris, just the clear, damning evidence of a vehicle that had gone over the edge into the churning, icy water below. The official report concluded the obvious. The bus, struggling for purchase on the ice-slicked road, had skidded and plunged into the river. The depth and ferocity of the Black River, swollen by the melting snow, made any recovery effort impossible. The bus and its 22 young passengers were declared lost, victims of a tragic and unavoidable accident. The unforgiving power of nature was named the sole culprit in the devastating loss of an entire generation of St. Jude's children. The case was officially closed. With no wreckage to examine and no bodies to recover, there was nothing left to investigate. The community was plunged into a state of collective mourning. The story of the lost Angelus choir became a permanent scar on the region's history, a ghost story whispered by parents to their children as a warning about the dangers of the mountains in winter. A monument was eventually erected, its cold stone bearing the 22 names. Father Michael became a figure of tragic stoicism. He delivered a heart-wrenching eulogy, his voice breaking as he remembered his lost little angels, now singing in a celestial choir. He was praised for his strength in the face of such unimaginable loss, and his reputation as a pious, dedicated man was cemented in the public consciousness. He carried the burden of the tragedy with a grace that the community found both admirable and deeply moving, never suspecting the truth he harbored. In the years that followed, St. Jude's Home for Children slowly withered. Without its celebrated choir, the donations dried up, and the institution lost its purpose. The once bustling halls grew quiet. The remaining children were transferred to other facilities, and the building itself began to fall into disrepair. The home, much like the children it had lost, faded from public memory, its stone walls holding secrets that time itself seemed determined to bury forever. For 50 years, the official narrative held fast, hardened into historical fact. The disappearance of the Angelus choir was a closed chapter, a sad footnote in the local annals. It was a story of innocence lost to the indiscriminate cruelty of a winter storm, a wound that had scarred over, but for a few, like Samuel's younger brother Alistair, it never truly healed. It remained a void of unanswered questions and a lifetime of unresolved grief. The community accepted the story because it was the only one offered. It was a simple, understandable tragedy that required no villain other than the weather. It was a narrative of fate, not malice. A tale of children taken too soon by an act of God. This explanation, while heartbreaking, provided a form of closure, allowing people to grieve and move on without the haunting complexities of a deeper, more disturbing possibility. But the truth was not swept away in the torrent of the Black River. It was not buried under 50 years of snow and sorrow. It was much closer, entombed in a place no one knew existed, waiting patiently within the very walls of St. Jude's. The official story was a carefully constructed facade, designed to conceal a crime so monstrous it defied imagination. The silence was not an absence of answers. It was the sound of a secret being kept. The memory of the choir became a local legend, their voices said to be heard on the wind during winter storms. Their story was a cautionary tale, a piece of folklore that defined the treacherous beauty of the mountains. The 22 children were transformed from real people into ethereal ghosts, their tragic end serving as a permanent, sorrowful fixture in the landscape. Their names were known, but their true fate remained a complete and utter mystery. The investigation had been thorough for its time, but it was ultimately defeated by the landscape and the weather. No one had any reason to suspect foul play. Father Michael was a man of the cloth. The children were orphans with few outside connections, and the storm provided the perfect, unassailable explanation. The tracks leading to the river were the final, conclusive piece of evidence in a puzzle that seemed to have only one possible solution. This accepted history was a neat, tragic bow placed upon a terrible loss. It was a story that brought a sense of order to a chaotic event, allowing society to categorize it and file it away. The narrative of a simple, devastating accident was the foundation upon which a half-century of mourning was built. But foundations can crack, and even the most deeply buried truths have a way of eventually finding their way to the surface, demanding to be seen. The world had moved on, but the mystery was never truly gone. It lingered in the crumbling stone of the abandoned orphanage, in the memories of the few remaining locals who remembered the choir's songs. It was a cold case in the truest sense, frozen in time by the blizzard of 1955. But the passage of 50 years had not erased the truth. It had only preserved it. What secrets did the walls of St. Jude's hold, and who had benefited from their silence? 50 years passed. The world that had mourned the Angelus Choir moved on, forging new histories and forgetting old sorrows. The story of the bus that vanished into the Black River solidified into a permanent piece of regional folklore, a cautionary tale, etched in stone and memory. St. Jude's Home for Children, however, did not endure. It became a hollowed-out carcass of a building, a monument to its own lost purpose. The windows were shattered, the great oak doors rotted on their hinges, and nature began the slow, inexorable process of reclaiming the stone fortress for itself, its secrets held tight within crumbling mortar. In the autumn of 2005, the silence was finally broken by the roar of machinery. The diocese, having long since abandoned the property, sold the land to a commercial developer with plans for a luxury mountain resort. The demolition was seen as a final necessary act of erasure, clearing away the last physical reminder of the 1955 tragedy to make way for the future. A crew of seasoned workers was brought in, their task straightforward: to level the old orphanage and prepare the foundation for a new beginning, unaware they were about to unearth a very old end. The work was methodical and loud, a symphony of destruction echoing through the mountain pass. Steel claws tore into weathered stone, and walls that had stood for a century came crashing down in clouds of dust. It was during the gutting of the main assembly hall, a cavernous room where the choir once practiced, that a foreman named Dave Kowalski noticed an anomaly. His sledgehammer, meant to test the integrity of a load-bearing wall, struck a section near the foundation with a strange, hollow thud, a sound distinctly different from the solid stone surrounding it. Curiosity piqued, Kowalski scraped away decades of plaster and grime. He discovered a section of wall that was not part of the original granite structure. It was brick, crudely laid and mortared, a clear and deliberate addition that had been plastered over to seamlessly blend in with the older stone. There were no records of this modification on the building's original blueprints, which he had studied meticulously. It was a wall that, according to all official documentation, simply should not have been there. It was a structural lie, hiding something within its depths. Gathering his crew, Kowalski made a decision that would alter the course of history. Against protocol, he ordered them to break through. The bricks were stubborn, but they eventually gave way, crumbling under the force of crowbars and hammers. As the first opening was created, a gust of stale, frigid air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of sealed-off time, of dust and decay that had not mingled with the outside world for half a century. The darkness behind the wall was absolute, a void that seemed to swallow the light from their work lamps. With the opening widened, they cautiously peered inside. Their flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing a space that defied all logic, a small, windowless chapel. It was perfectly preserved in a state of arrested decay, coated in a thick, uniform blanket of gray dust. A dozen small wooden pews sat in silent rows, facing a simple stone altar. The air was unnaturally still, the silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure against their eardrums. This was not a forgotten room, it was a tomb, intentionally sealed away from the world. The foreman and his men stepped inside, their heavy work boots leaving the first footprints in the dust of 50 years. The space was no larger than a one-car garage, its existence a complete mystery. Why would anyone build a chapel only to immediately brick it up, erasing it from the building's very memory? It felt sacrilegious, a secret buried within a house of God. Their eyes scanned the room, taking in the eerie stillness, the silent pews, and the cold stone altar that served as the chamber's undeniable focal point. It was on that altar that they saw it. Sitting in the center, arranged in a neat, deliberate stack, were 22 leather-bound books. They were untouched by the worst of the decay, their dark covers only lightly dusted. Kowalski approached slowly, a sense of reverence and dread settling over him. He wiped the cover of the top book with his gloved hand, revealing the elegant gold foil lettering that was still shockingly bright. It read, "The Angelus Choir, St. Jude's Home for Children." Below it, a single name was embossed, Samuel Finch. The discovery of the Lost Chapel, as the media quickly dubbed it, became a statewide sensation. It was a poignant and baffling postscript to a tragedy that had long since passed into legend. News reports portrayed it as a curious, sentimental find, a time capsule of the choir's final days. For most, it was a historical curiosity. But for one man, watching the evening news from his university office hundreds of miles away, it was a lightning bolt that struck the heart of a 50-year-old wound, reigniting a pain that had never truly faded into a scar. Dr. Alistair Finch, a tenured history professor at a prestigious university, was Samuel Finch's younger brother. At 6 years old, he had been too young and too sickly to join the choir, a twist of fate that had saved his life but condemned him to a lifetime of unresolved grief. The official story of the bus crash had never satisfied his academic, analytical mind. It was too neat, too simple, leaving a void of unanswered questions that had fueled his life's work. The news report was not a postscript. It was a new, explosive first chapter. Consumed by a sudden, desperate hope, Alistair immediately contacted the local authorities. He identified himself and asserted his claim as the sole surviving next of kin to his brother's songbook. The bureaucracy was slow, but his academic credentials and the unique nature of his request eventually won them over. A week later, a carefully sealed package arrived at his office. Inside lay the book that had last been held by his brother on that fateful winter night in 1955. It felt heavier than leather and paper. It felt like the weight of 50 lost years. For hours, Alistair sat in the quiet of his study, the book open before him. He turned each page with a surgeon's care, the scent of old paper and dust filling the air. He was searching for anything, a note, a tear stain, a folded corner, some final silent message from the brother he had idolized. The pages were filled with Samuel's neat practiced notations on musical theory, but nothing seemingly out of the ordinary. His hope began to wane, replaced by the familiar ache of disappointment, the feeling that this, too, was another dead end. He ran a hand over the pages of a hymn titled, O Come, Emmanuel, a song he remembered Samuel practicing endlessly. It was then that his fingers brushed against a series of faint indentations in the margin. He angled the desk lamp, his breath catching in his throat. They were not smudges or random marks. They were tiny, deliberate pencil annotations, a series of dots, dashes, and small circles arranged in a precise pattern next to certain lines of the hymn. To anyone else, they would have been utterly meaningless, invisible noise on the page. But Alistair saw them for exactly what they were, a jolt electric and fierce shot through him. It was their code. A simple substitution cipher he and Samuel had invented as children to pass secret messages, a game born of boyhood imagination and brotherhood. Samuel had used it to communicate with him from beyond the grave. The official story, the storm, the slick roads, the tragic accident, had always been a narrative of passive, impersonal fate, but a coded message was an active, intentional act. It was a warning. The discovery transformed Alistair's grief into a singular, burning purpose. For 5 decades, he had mourned a brother lost to an act of God. Now, holding this book, he was confronted with the chilling possibility that Samuel had been lost to an act of man. The songbook was not a memento of a tragedy. It was evidence of a crime. The neatly stacked books on the altar were not a memorial. They were a message left behind by children who knew they were in terrible danger and had taken their one desperate chance to leave a trail. This was the moment the cold case thawed, the instant a historical tragedy became a live investigation. The accepted narrative, a foundation of regional grief for half a century, had developed its first undeniable crack. The choir had not been heading for a concert. Father Michael had not sent them out into a blizzard on a mission of financial necessity. The story everyone knew, the story that had provided a somber and definitive closure, was a lie. The children had been led into that secret chapel for a reason. Alistair's hands trembled as he stared at the coded message. A lifetime of sorrow and questions now had a focal point. He was no longer just a grieving brother. He was the sole recipient of a final, desperate plea for help sent across a chasm of 50 years. The code was the key not just to what happened that night, but to why it had been so effectively covered up. The truth was not at the bottom of the Black River, buried under silt and stone. It was right here, in his hands, written in a secret language. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he was standing at the precipice of a terrible truth. The discovery of the chapel was not the end of the story. It was the violent, jarring beginning of the real one. The official report had closed the book on the Angelus Choir in 1955, but Samuel had just opened it again. The puzzle of their disappearance was far more complex and sinister than a simple vehicle accident, and the pieces were scattered across 50 years of enforced silence and carefully constructed lies. The authorities had concluded that the bus plunged into the river, but there had never been any wreckage, no oil slick, no debris, no bodies ever recovered. These were dismissed as consequences of the river's depth and violent currents. But now, These missing pieces of evidence took on a new, more ominous meaning. What if the bus never went into the river at all? What if the tracks leading to the cliff's edge were not evidence of an accident, but the first act of a masterful deception? Alistair looked from the coded message to the faded photograph of Samuel on his desk, a solemn boy with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. He had been the choir's protector, their older brother, in all but blood. It made perfect sense that he would be the one to find a way to leave a warning, to ensure that the truth, no matter how long it took, would one day find its voice. And Alistair, the historian, the seeker of facts, was now that voice. The narrative of a tragic accident had served a purpose, providing comfort and closure to a grieving community. It was a story of nature's impersonal fury, a version of events that required no villain. But the coded message in his brother's songbook promised a different story altogether, one of human malice and calculated betrayal. The man who had been praised for his stoic grace in the face of tragedy, Father Michael, was at the center of it all. His insistence on the concert, his control over the home, now seemed sinister. The initial shock of the discovery began to recede, replaced by a cold, academic resolve. Alistair would need more than a childhood cipher to overturn 50 years of accepted history. He would need to be methodical, to build a case brick by brick, just as someone had once built that wall to entomb a secret. He would have to follow the path his brother had laid out for him, deciphering the message that he prayed would lead to the truth of what happened in that hidden chapel. He carefully took out a notepad and began the painstaking work of transcribing the cipher, his mind racing with possibilities. Each dot and dash was a ghost, whispering from the past. Samuel had known something was wrong. He had documented it. The final frantic entries would paint a chilling picture of their last hours, revealing that the children were not victims of a storm, but of a conspiracy orchestrated by the very man who was supposed to be their shepherd, their protector, their father. The silence of St. Jude's was not one of reverence for the dead. It was the silence of a cover-up. The forgotten chapel was not a memorial. It was the initial crime scene, the place where the children's fate was sealed before they were ever loaded onto a bus. The songbooks were not relics. They were a final, desperate act of testimony from a boy who knew he was marching toward his doom and was determined not to go quietly into the long, dark night. The police had followed the tire tracks to the cliff's edge and stopped, believing they had found their answer. They had looked in the wrong place. The real clues were never out in the snow, but hidden within the very walls of the orphanage. The investigation had been misled from the very beginning, diverted by a perfectly staged scene designed to point everyone away from the truth. The real question was not how the bus crashed, but who drove it. Alistair Finch felt the weight of 22 lost souls settle upon his shoulders. He was their only advocate now, the only one who held the key to unlocking their true fate. The official story was a carefully constructed fiction, and he was about to become the author of its final brutal chapter. His grief, once a quiet and constant companion, had now become a weapon. He would use it to dismantle the lie, piece by piece, until the truth was all that remained. The mystery of the Angelus Choir was no longer a ghost story whispered on the wind. It was an active murder investigation. The discovery of the chapel and the coded message had provided the two things a cold case needs most: new evidence and a relentless seeker of the truth. Alistair would not rest until he knew what had happened to his brother and the other 21 children who had walked into that chapel and vanished from the face of the earth. The scope of the conspiracy was something he could not yet fathom. Who else was involved? How had they maintained the secret for so long? These questions loomed large, but for now he had a starting point. A message from his brother, a thread to pull. He knew that by pulling it, he might unravel the lives of powerful people and expose a rot that went far deeper than the decaying walls of St. Jude's Home for Children. The path forward would be fraught with resistance. The diocese would protect its own, and the community would be reluctant to abandon a half-century of belief. He would be challenging not just a police report, but a collective memory, a foundational myth of their town's history. But the truth had a right to be heard, and the voices of the Angelus Choir, silenced for 50 years, were finally about to be heard once more through the cryptic message left in a hymn book. The world believed the children were at the bottom of a river, their songs lost to the current. But they were wrong. The song had not ended. Samuel Finch had made sure of that. He had written a final verse in a language only his brother would understand, a verse that would finally expose the monster who had sold his angels. But this discovery was only the first piece of a macabre puzzle that nobody was prepared to assemble. The painstaking work of deciphering his brother's final message began in the hallowed silence of Alistair's university study. He worked under a single pool of lamplight, transcribing each dot and dash from the hymn book's margin onto a large grid. The simple substitution cipher, once a game of childhood secrets, was now a key to unlocking a 50-year-old tomb of lies. Each translated letter felt like a ghost's whisper, a word spoken across a chasm of time. The initial entries were filled with a boy's excitement for the upcoming concert, mundane details of practice and friendships, painting a vivid picture of the life that was about to be extinguished. Alistair felt a profound and aching connection to the brother he barely remembered, the neat, disciplined handwriting a testament to the solemn boy he had idolized. As he progressed, the tone of the annotations shifted dramatically. The childlike excitement gave way to a creeping sense of confusion and unease. The entries became shorter, more frantic. Then came the first bombshell, a revelation that shattered the very foundation of the official narrative. Samuel wrote that on the night of the blizzard, Father Michael had gathered them not in the main hall to board a bus for the capital, but had instead led them down a dark, narrow corridor Alistair never knew existed. He had taken them to a place Samuel described as the secret chapel, a place of stone and suffocating silence, for what he promised would be a special prayer before their important journey. The lie was breathtaking in its audacity. The entire premise of the trip, the concert, the fundraising, the battle against the storm, was a fabrication. Alistair's hands grew cold as he translated the next passage, which detailed Father Michael's grand announcement inside the sealed room. He had told the choir that their talent was too great for Pennsylvania, that a secret benefactor had arranged for them to embark on a surprise international tour. They were to become world famous, singing in the grand cathedrals of Europe. It was a dream come true, a fantasy so potent that it would have easily overwhelmed any fear or suspicion in the minds of the young, isolated orphans who craved such a destiny. The instructions, as Samuel recorded them, were chillingly specific. They were to leave immediately without any of their personal belongings. Everything would be provided for them on this new adventure. Their departure was to be a complete secret, a grand surprise for the world. Father Michael framed it as an act of profound faith and opportunity, a divine reward for their beautiful voices. This single, decoded passage transformed the narrative from a tragic accident into a meticulously planned disappearance. The children had not been lost to the storm. They had been deliberately removed from their lives under the guise of a miraculous gift from the man they trusted implicitly. The final legible entry was a scrawl of pure terror, the disciplined handwriting devolving into a panicked rush of pencil strokes. Samuel, ever observant, had noticed things the younger children missed. The men who came for them were not the friendly bus drivers they knew. The vehicle waiting outside was not their familiar yellow school bus. It was a dark, unmarked vehicle with curtained windows. The last coherent phrase Alistair could decipher was a stark, horrifying sentence that echoed the finality of a slamming door. Wrong bus. Strangers. He locked the door from the outside. The message ended there, an abrupt cessation that spoke of a book hastily hidden, a final act of testimony before being silenced forever. Armed with this terrifying new timeline, Alistair knew he could not proceed alone. He took his findings, the songbook, his translated notes, the official 1955 police report, to the state police headquarters and requested a meeting with their cold case division. He was assigned to Detective Miles Corbin, a man in his late 50s with weary eyes that had seen the worst of human nature and a deeply ingrained skepticism for stories that sounded like fiction. Corbin listened patiently, his expression unreadable, as Alistair laid out the incredible tale of the secret chapel, the coded message, and the abduction orchestrated by a revered priest. It was a story that defied 50 years of accepted history. Initially, Detective Corbin was dismissive, viewing Alistair as a grieving brother chasing ghosts, his academic mind constructing a conspiracy out of sorrow and coincidence. The official report was clear: tire tracks, a cliff, a raging river. It was a textbook tragedy, but the physical evidence of the songbook was undeniable. The coded message, however fantastical its contents, was real. What truly piqued Corbin's professional curiosity was the existence of the bricked-up chapel itself. Why would anyone seal off a room in such a permanent and clandestine manner? It was an act of concealment, and Corbin knew with the instinct of a seasoned investigator that people only go to such lengths to hide the most terrible of secrets. Their first official step was to pay a visit to the man at the center of Samuel's final message. Father Michael was now Monsignor Michael Reeves, living in a comfortable, well-appointed retirement home run by the diocese. At 92, he was frail, but his mind remained sharp, his eyes a clear, pale blue. He was a pillar of the community, a celebrated figure whose life was defined by his selfless dedication and his stoic endurance of the 1955 tragedy. When Corbin and Alistair arrived, they found him in a sun-drenched library, reading. He greeted them with a serene, grandfatherly smile, the very image of piety and grace, projecting an aura of untouchable virtue. Corbin began the interview gently, framing it as a simple follow-up to the historical discovery at the old orphanage. He asked Monsignor Michael about the secret chapel. A flicker of something unreadable passed through the old man's eyes before he dismissed it with a wave of his thin hand. He claimed it was likely an old forgotten prayer room from the building's earliest days, sealed off during a renovation he barely remembered. His memory, he explained with a soft, apologetic smile, was not what it used to be. He spoke of the choir with a practiced, solemn grief, recounting the official story of the terrible blizzard and the tragic accident, as if reading from a sacred text he had memorized long ago. Alistair, unable to contain his simmering rage, presented the songbook and spoke of the coded message. He watched the Monsignor's face for any sign of recognition, any crack in the serene facade. But Michael's expression remained one of paternal concern. He looked at Alistair with pity, suggesting that a lifetime of grief had perhaps led him to see patterns where none existed. He claimed Samuel was a boy with a vivid imagination, prone to fantastical stories. The old man's performance was masterful. He was not just denying the accusation. He was pathologizing his accuser, using Alistair's own pain as a tool to discredit the evidence. His calm was absolute and utterly chilling. The interview was a dead end, but it served a crucial purpose. It showed them the formidable nature of their opponent. Monsignor Michael was insulated by a lifetime of goodwill and the powerful protection of the diocese. They would need more than a child's coded message to bring him down. They would need hard, irrefutable evidence that could punch through the armor of his reputation. Their investigation now pivoted from deciphering the past to scrutinizing it with the tools of the present. The first target was the one area where even the most careful of criminals often leave a trail: money. who, if anyone, had benefited financially from the disappearance of 22 children. Alistair's academic credentials granted him access to the diocesan archives, a dusty, climate-controlled vault containing a century of church history. He and Corbin spent weeks poring over brittle financial ledgers from the 1950s, their fingers stained with the dust of forgotten transactions. The records for St. Jude's were meticulously kept by Father Michael himself, every penny accounted for. But then they found it. An entry dated December 21, 1955, the day after the choir vanished. It was a single-line item, a massive anonymous donation recorded simply as "Gift for the Children's Future." The amount was staggering for the time, equivalent to several $million today. The donation was a glaring anomaly. In an institution that survived on the patronage of named benefactors, a contribution of this magnitude arriving anonymously, precisely as the orphanage lost its primary fundraising asset, made no logical sense. It was not a donation. It was a payment. Modern forensic accounting software allowed them to trace the transaction's origins, a task that would have been impossible in 1955. The funds were routed through a series of shell corporations, beginning with a bank in Zurich and ending in the diocesan accounts. The trail was intentionally convoluted, designed to be untraceable, a clear hallmark of a criminal transaction designed to launder illicit funds. This financial discovery provided the motive that had been missing. The Angelus Choir had not just been removed, they had been sold. The narrative of a surprise international tour, as described in Samuel's journal, was likely the lie told to the children. But the underlying truth was a monstrous business deal. The investigation now had two powerful pillars: Samuel's testimony from the grave and a clear, incriminating money trail pointing directly to Father Michael, the sole administrator of St. Jude's finances. The official story of a tragic accident was not just a lie, but a cover for a crime of unimaginable greed and cruelty. The next step was to dismantle the physical evidence of the official report, the bus. According to the 1955 file, the vehicle belonged to the regional charter company, Allegheny Transit. Corbin pulled the company's archived service logs from that year. He and Alistair meticulously cross-referenced every charter recorded for the week of the disappearance. There was no record of a bus being chartered by St. Jude's Home for Children on December 20, 1955. No driver was assigned, no vehicle was dispatched. The bus that supposedly plunged into the Black River, the central artifact of the entire tragedy, had, according to all official records, never existed. The implication was staggering. The scene at the cliff's edge had been a masterful piece of staging. Someone had driven a bus, a different, untraceable bus, out onto the pass during the blizzard, pointed it toward the cliff, and let it go, creating a set of tracks that would lead investigators to a false and convenient conclusion. The storm itself provided the perfect cover, ensuring no one would witness the deception and that the river would be blamed for swallowing the evidence. It was a brilliantly simple plan, executed with a cold, calculated precision that spoke of a mind devoid of any conscience. The entire investigation in 1955 had been intentionally misdirected from the very first day. Corbin decided it was time to revisit the original witness list. Most were long dead, but they found one name still living, Eleanor Vance, who had been a young 17-year-old kitchen hand at St. Jude's in 1955. Now in her late 60s, she lived in a small town a few counties over. Her memory of that night was clouded by time and the trauma of the event. But under Corbin's patient and careful questioning, a detail surfaced, something she had mentioned to the original investigators, who had dismissed it as irrelevant in the face of the tracks found by the river. Eleanor recalled watching the children leave from the kitchen window. She remembered being struck by how odd the bus looked. Their usual bus was a bright, cheerful yellow, a familiar sight on the mountain roads. But the bus that night, she recalled with a slow, dawning certainty, was different. It was a dark color, maybe green or black, and it looked older, more industrial. She also remembered seeing the driver and another man in the front seat. They were strangers, not their regular driver, a kind man named Gus, whom all the children adored. Her testimony, dismissed 50 years ago, now perfectly corroborated Samuel's final terrified words, "Wrong bus, strangers." The case against Monsignor Michael was now a fortress of interconnected evidence. The coded diary provided the victim's testimony, the financial records provided the motive, the phantom charter logs proved the official story was a fabrication, and Eleanor Vance's eyewitness account provided the corroboration. Every piece of new evidence systematically dismantled the 50-year-old narrative, revealing the sinister architecture of the conspiracy that lay beneath. The beloved Monsignor was not a grieving shepherd. He was a human trafficker who had sold his flock for a fortune and hidden his crime behind a perfectly constructed tragedy. Alistair felt a grim satisfaction, but no peace. He had exposed the how of the crime, the deception, the staged accident, the financial transaction. He had proven that his brother and the other children were not victims of fate, but of a monstrous betrayal. The sheer scale of the deception was horrifying, requiring a level of planning and cold-blooded resolve that was difficult to comprehend. Michael had not only condemned 22 children to an unknown, terrible fate, but had also forced an entire community to mourn a lie, building his legacy on their manufactured grief. His piety was a mask, his entire life a performance. The focus of the investigation now narrowed to a single burning question. If the bus never went into the river and the children were driven away by strangers, where did they go? The money trail had originated in Zurich, but its ultimate source was still obscured. The coded message had provided the timeline of the abduction, but had Samuel left one final clue, one piece of information that could reveal the ultimate destination? Alistair returned to the songbook, his eyes scanning the coded message one last time, searching for any nuance or symbol he might have overlooked in his initial translation. He was certain his brother, in his final moments, would have tried to leave a map. He noticed a small circled number next to the title of the hymn where the code was written, O come, Emmanuel." It was the number 3. Initially he had dismissed it as a stray mark, perhaps indicating the third verse. But it was circled deliberately. On a hunch he cross-referenced the hymn number in the book's index. The third hymn in the book was a lesser-known piece titled, "The Earth is the Lord's." It seemed like another dead end until he looked at the coded annotations again. Next to the final frantic entry, there was a single tiny, almost invisible drawing, a small pickaxe, the kind used in mining. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying resonance. A Swiss bank known for its secrecy and dealings with less than reputable clients. A large, untraceable payment. And now, a symbol for mining. The international tour was a lie, but the international part was likely true. The children hadn't been sent to sing in European cathedrals. They had been sold as laborers, their small bodies and untraceable origins making them the perfect victims for an operation that needed a disposable workforce, hidden far from the eyes of the world. The image of the Angelus Choir, their ethereal voices silenced, breaking rocks in a dark mine somewhere, was a vision of hell that solidified Alistair's resolve. Detective Corbin, leveraging this new theory, began digging into international criminal archives from the era. He searched for any syndicates or corporations from the 1950s that were known to use illicit labor, particularly those with financial ties to the Zurich Bank identified in the transfer. The search was a long shot, a search for a needle in a global haystack of historical crime. But the profile was specific, a powerful entity needing a significant number of untraceable individuals with the resources to arrange a complex international abduction and the ruthlessness to make 22 children vanish from the face of the earth without a trace. The weight of the truth was suffocating. Alistair realized that Father Michael could not have acted alone, orchestrating a deception of this magnitude, procuring a decoy bus, arranging for unknown drivers, coordinating a multi-million-dollar international wire transfer in 1955, and ensuring the silence of anyone else involved, required a network. The conspiracy extended far beyond the stone walls of St. Jude's. The kindly priest was not just a monster, but a cog in a much larger, more terrifying machine. Who were his partners? Who were the strangers on the bus? Who had benefited from the silence that had lasted for half a century? The investigation had reached a critical juncture. They had a motive, a method, and a primary suspect whose alibi and historical account had been systematically obliterated. The narrative had shifted from a cold case about a tragic accident to a live investigation into a conspiracy of human trafficking and mass murder. The revered Monsignor Michael Reeves was no longer shielded by his reputation. He was cornered by a series of facts that pointed to his guilt with the damning precision of a compass needle pointing north. His carefully constructed world, built on a foundation of lies, was beginning to crumble under the weight of a truth that had refused to stay buried. Alistair looked again at the songbook, the physical link to his lost brother. It had been a message in a bottle, cast into an ocean of time, and he had been the one to find it. He felt the presence of all 22 children, their silenced voices demanding justice. The investigation had exposed the crime, but it had not yet brought accountability. Monsignor Michael was old and frail, protected by powerful institutions. To ensure justice, they would need something more than circumstantial evidence and a 50-year-old coded message. They needed a confession or something just as good, an undeniable piece of proof that would be his final, absolute undoing. The pressure on Monsignor Michael was mounting. Detective Corbin had made it clear that the investigation was now focused solely on him. The diocese, once fiercely protective, began to distance itself as the evidence became public knowledge through strategic leaks to the press. The story of the lost choir was no longer a tale of tragedy, but of profound betrayal, and the Monsignor's carefully curated image was shattering. He retreated into a self-imposed silence, refusing all further interviews, his serene facade replaced by the grim, tight-lipped expression of a man who knew the ghosts of his past were finally breaking down his door. Alistair's thoughts returned to the secret chapel. It was the starting point of the crime, the place where the children's fate was sealed. He felt an unshakable conviction that if there was one final piece of evidence, one proof trophy that could incriminate Michael beyond all doubt, it had to be there. Samuel's message had led them this far, but it felt incomplete. Was there something else he had hidden? Something the demolition crew had missed in their initial discovery? The chapel was the alpha of the crime. Alistair was certain it must also contain the omega. The investigation had methodically peeled back the layers of deception, revealing the monstrous truth piece by piece. First, the existence of the secret chapel itself, a physical manifestation of a hidden reality. Then, the coded message, the voice of the victim speaking from the past. This was followed by the discovery of the financial motive, the untraceable payment that reeked of a criminal transaction. Then came the dismantling of the official alibi, the proof that the bus charter was a fiction and the accident scene a deliberate stage. Finally, the corroboration from an eyewitness, confirming the presence of strangers and a different vehicle. Each revelation had been a hammer blow against the 50-year-old lie. The story of a natural tragedy had been replaced by a story of human evil, orchestrated by a man who had cloaked his depravity in the robes of piety. The community's grief was now curdling into a collective sense of outrage and betrayal. The monument bearing the 22 names, once a symbol of sorrowful remembrance, now felt like an artifact of a massive, cruel deception. The children hadn't been lost to the mountain, they had been stolen from it. The team secured a warrant to conduct a forensic search of the Monsignor's apartment in the retirement home. They were searching for anything: old letters, bank statements, a hidden journal that might connect him to the 1955 transaction or the mining syndicate. They found nothing. Michael had been too careful, too meticulous in covering his tracks over the decades. He had lived an exemplary life, leaving no loose threads. It seemed that his wall of silence would hold, that he might just escape justice through a lack of conclusive physical proof tying him directly to the crime. But Alistair remained fixated on the chapel. He reviewed the demolition crew's photos of the discovery. He saw the pews, the altar, the neat stack of songbooks. It all looked exactly as described. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. He remembered the circled number 3 and the third hymn. It led him to the mining theory. But what if it had a dual meaning? What if it pointed to something physical? The third pew, the third floorboard, the third stone from the left? It was a desperate leap of logic born from the conviction that his brother's intelligence would not have stopped at just one clue. He convinced a reluctant Detective Corbin to revisit the site of the demolished orphanage one last time. The area was now a construction site, but the foundation of the main hall, including the footprint of the secret chapel, was still intact. Armed with blueprints and measuring tapes, they located the precise spot where the altar had once stood. It was just a patch of dirt and broken concrete now, but it was the epicenter of the entire mystery. Alistair felt a strange energy in that spot, a feeling of being on the precipice of the final terrible discovery. The team began a careful excavation of the area beneath where the altar had been. They dug through layers of dirt and debris, their work slow and methodical. Hours passed, and they found nothing but rock and soil. Corbin was about to call it a day, convinced Alistair's hunch was just another dead end born of hope. But then one of the officers' shovels struck something that wasn't stone. It was a dull metallic thud. They cleared the dirt away carefully, their hands now working with a surgeon's precision, unearthing the object from its 50-year grave. It was a small tin box, rusted but still sealed, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp. The air grew thick with anticipation. This was it. This was the final piece Samuel had left for them. Inside that box, Alistair knew, lay the irrefutable proof that would not just expose a monster but finally bring justice for the Angelus choir. The long, methodical process of dismantling the lie had led them to this single point in time and space. They had followed the breadcrumbs his brother had left across a half-century. The entire investigation had been a process of reversal, of traveling back in time to undo a perfectly constructed lie. It had required the dismantling of a public myth, the challenging of a powerful institution, and the confrontation of a man who had become a living saint. The methodical accumulation of evidence had cornered their suspect, leaving him with no plausible deniability. The narrative of the tragic accident was dead, replaced by a far more sinister and complex truth of abduction and conspiracy. The case was no longer about what had happened. They knew what had happened. It was now about proving it in a way that no one could ever deny. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming, but a jury would need something more, something that placed the weapon, metaphorically, in Monsignor Michael's hand. This small tin box, unearthed from the dirt, represented that final crucial piece of the puzzle. The official history was a lie. But what terrible, undeniable truth had Samuel Finch managed to capture and bury as his last act on earth? Detective Corbin lifted the small, rusted tin box from its earthen grave, handling it with the reverence one might reserve for a holy relic. The weight of 50 years seemed concentrated in the small object, a density of secrets that felt palpable in the cool autumn air. For Alistair, the sight of it was a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. This was Samuel's final act of defiance, a message in a bottle cast not into an ocean, but into the very ground of his prison. He knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and electrifying, that the answers he had sought for a lifetime were contained within that decaying metal shell. Back in the sterile environment of the State Police Forensics Lab, the box was opened with surgical precision. The rusted hinges groaned in protest, breaking a silence that had been kept for half a century. Inside, nestled within the protective oilcloth, lay a single object that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. A small 3-inch reel of audio tape. It was an artifact from a bygone era, a fragile ribbon of magnetic memory. To the younger technicians, it was an antique. To Alistair and Corbin, it was the Rosetta Stone of a monstrous crime, the undeniable proof trophy they so desperately needed. The immediate challenge was a technological one. Finding a functional reel-to-reel player from the 1950s that could handle the delicate tape without destroying it required a frantic search through police archives and university audiovisual departments. Finally, a perfectly preserved machine was located. In a soundproofed room, with Alistair, Corbin, and a lead prosecutor present, a technician carefully threaded the brittle tape. The room was silent, the three men holding their breath as the machine whirred to life, the speakers emitting a low, expectant hiss of static that sounded like the whisper of ghosts. Then a voice emerged from the crackle, thin and young but clear. It was Samuel. His words were a hushed, urgent whisper documenting his actions. "He locked us in," the voice said, the boys' fear a tangible thing across the decades. "He told us about a tour, but something is wrong. The other men, they aren't from the church." The recording was a real-time account of his final moments of freedom, a desperate attempt to create a record, to ensure that the truth would have a voice, even if he and the others were silenced forever. Samuel had not just left a clue, he had left his testimony. The tape continued, capturing the muffled sound of the chapel door being unbolted. Two new voices entered the recording, their footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The first was instantly recognizable, its familiar pious cadence now dripping with a sinister resonance. Father Michael. The second voice was unfamiliar, deeper, with a clipped, precise accent that was clearly not local. "Is the payment confirmed?" the stranger asked, his tone devoid of emotion, the words purely transactional. "The Zurich transfer was completed this morning," Father Michael replied, his voice a cold, steady baritone that betrayed no hint of conscience. The conversation that followed laid the conspiracy bare in all its horrifying detail. The stranger confirmed he was an agent for a South American mining conglomerate that had recently acquired a series of remote, unregulated diamond mines. They required a workforce that was untraceable, with no family to ask questions and no official records of their existence. Orphans, he noted with chilling pragmatism, were the ideal candidates. They were invisible people, their disappearance easily explained away and quickly forgotten by a world that had already discarded them once before. The Angelus Choir was not being sent on tour, they were being sold into slavery. Then came the single soul-crushing line that would seal the Monsignor's fate. The stranger expressed a fleeting concern about the potential for a prolonged search, the risk of discovery. From the speakers, Father Michael's voice responded with a laugh, a dry, dismissive sound completely alien to his public persona. "Worry about the river, not the children," he said, his words sharp and cruel. "They are orphans. No one of consequence will miss them for long. In the eyes of the world, they are ghosts already." The tape ended abruptly with the sound of a struggle, a muffled cry, and then silence. The silence that filled the audio lab was absolute, a vacuum where the air had once been. The prosecutor slowly removed his glasses, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. Detective Corbin simply stared at the machine, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. Alistair felt a cold, hollow emptiness expand within his chest. He had imagined a monster, but the reality of the man on that tape, the casual cruelty, the utter lack of humanity, the dismissal of 22 children, as inconvenient ghosts, was more depraved than anything his grief-stricken mind could have ever conceived. The recording was not just evidence, it was a confession, captured and preserved by the very victim he had condemned. Armed with the tape, the final confrontation was swift and decisive. Corbin and Alistair, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers, found Monsignor Michael in the same sun-drenched library where he had first lied to their faces. He sat in his high-backed chair, a book in his lap, the very picture of serene intellectual piety. He greeted them with a look of weary condescension, as if their persistence were a childish annoyance. He had built his fortress of lies over 50 years, and in his arrogance he believed it to be impenetrable, certain that no evidence from so long ago could possibly survive to challenge him. Corbin did not waste time with accusations. He simply placed the vintage reel-to-reel player on the ornate table between them. He threaded the tape, the familiar clicks and whirs echoing in the quiet room. The Monsignor watched with a detached curiosity, a faint patronizing smile playing on his lips. He seemed to believe this was some desperate theatrical bluff, but as the hiss of static gave way to the unmistakable acoustics of the stone chapel, his posture stiffened. When the sound of his own younger voice filled the library, the smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of pure, unadulterated panic. He listened, his face draining of all color, as his 50-year-old crime played out before him. The calm negotiation, the discussion of the untraceable children, the confirmation of the Zurich payment, each word was a hammer blow, dismantling the facade of his entire life. When the tape reached his final damning statement about the children being ghosts already, a choked, guttural sound escaped his throat. The serene holy man was gone, replaced by a withered, cornered animal, his pale blue eyes wide with the terror of a truth that had finally inexorably caught up with him. The mask did not just crack, it shattered into 1,000 pieces. The confession that followed was not one of remorse, but of rage. He spat the words out, his voice trembling with a lifetime of suppressed resentment. He spoke of his brilliance, his ambition, and how the church had relegated him to a remote, impoverished orphanage in the mountains. The children, he seethed, were a burden, their needs a constant drain on resources he felt were owed to him. The money was not just a payment, it was a vindication, a reclaiming of the status and wealth he believed was his birthright. He had not sold children, he had liquidated an asset he felt he owned. His motive was a toxic cocktail of profound narcissism, greed, and a deep-seated contempt for the very children he was tasked to protect. The Angelus Choir, with their celebrated talent, was his most valuable commodity. He had viewed their voices not as a gift from God, but as a financial instrument. The blizzard of 1955 was not a tragic coincidence. It was the perfect opportunity, a divine cloak for a diabolical transaction. He showed no regret for the lives he had destroyed, only a bitter fury that his perfect crime had been undone by the one thing he had never accounted for, the stubborn, resourceful intelligence of a 14-year-old boy. The arrest of Monsignor Michael Reeves was a quiet, almost anticlimactic affair. The image of the frail 92-year-old man, a celebrated figure of the diocese, being led from his luxurious retirement home in handcuffs, was a shocking spectacle that played on every news channel in the country. The pillar of the community had been exposed as a human trafficker, a monster hiding in plain sight. His carefully constructed legacy, built on a foundation of feigned grief and sanctimonious lies, crumbled to dust in a single afternoon. The truth, once revealed, was absolute and unforgiving. The subsequent legal proceedings were a formality. The audio tape was irrefutable. The diocese, facing a scandal of historic proportions, offered no defense and issued a public statement of profound shame and apology. Monsignor Michael, held in a secure medical facility, refused to speak another word, retreating into a stony silence from which he would never emerge. He was declared fit to stand trial, But his body, ravaged by age and the shock of his exposure, gave out before a verdict could be rendered. He died in his sleep 3 weeks after his arrest, escaping the judgment of a court, but not of history. Justice, in the end, was not delivered by a gavel, but by the revelation of the truth itself. The story of the Angelus Choir was rewritten. News outlets across the globe recounted the tale not of a tragic accident, but of a monstrous betrayal and the boy who had engineered a message to the future. The community, once united in mourning a lie, was now united in a shared sense of rage and sorrow for the true fate of their lost children. The lie had provided a simple, palatable grief. The truth delivered a complex and agonizing wound, but it was a wound that could finally begin to heal. The old monument on Route 9, its inscription honoring the victims of a winter storm, was quietly dismantled. In its place, a new memorial was erected near the grounds of the former orphanage. It featured the names of all 22 children etched in polished granite. Below them, a new inscription was carved, telling the true story of their fate and honoring the bravery of their leader. It read, "Their voices were silenced, but his final message was heard. The truth endures." The choir's story was no longer a ghost story. It was a testament to courage in the face of absolute evil. For Alistair, the resolution brought not victory, but a profound and somber peace. The gnawing uncertainty that had defined his life was gone, replaced by the heavy burden of knowledge. He stood before the new monument, tracing his brother's name with his fingertips. He had found the answers he had spent a lifetime seeking. He had delivered justice for Samuel and the other children. The weight of their memory, which he had carried alone for so long, was now shared by the world. His personal quest was over, the final chapter of his family's tragedy finally written. He kept a copy of the tape. He listened to it one last time, not to hear the monster's confession, but to hear his brother's voice, hushed but determined in the darkness of the chapel. He heard not a victim, but a protector, using his final moments to fight back in the only way he could. Samuel had been the choir's older brother to the very end, his final act an attempt to ensure their story would not be erased. He had planted a seed of truth in the dark, trusting that, one day, it would find the light. The legacy of the Angelus Choir was no longer one of tragic loss, but of incredible resilience. Their fate served as a horrifying reminder of the depths of human depravity. But Samuel's final message served as a more powerful testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. The truth, no matter how deep it is buried or how long it is hidden behind a wall of lies and silence, does not decay. It waits patiently for a voice to give it life, proving that even after 50 years, the quietest whisper from the past can be strong enough to bring down empires and, finally, irrevocably set the record straight.